So, dear learner, I welcome you all to this course that is on understanding human rights. So far, we have discussed the key concepts or the basic concept to understand human rights, and we discussed in our previous class about justice. Before that, we discussed liberty and equality. So, rights, liberty, equality, and justice we have already discussed. Now, we are coming to discuss one of the most important topics that you have been given in this syllabus, and that is United Nations and human rights. And then in the United Nations and human rights, we'll be discussing UN Charter and the UDHR. But here, first of all, we will discuss United Nations and human rights, not the UDHR or ICCPR and ICSCR. We will take up in another class. So here we are going to discuss UN and human rights. Before we go into the details of what kind of approach United Nations has adopted to promote human rights across the globe, it is pertinent to understand the debate over the nature of man. Why? Because you see that United Nations was established on the ashes of the Second World War, which was the most destructive war in the history of humankind. So that's why before we go to the approach of the United Nations towards the promotion of human rights, first of all, we should try to understand the debate over the nature of man. While discussing about the social contract theory or the natural rights theory and all, we were discussing and we were mentioning social contract of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. And we found that there was divergence of approach so far as the human nature is concerned. So according to Thomas Hobbes, human nature is essentially, it is aggressive, violent and selfish. Before Hobbes, Machiavelli also, explained that human nature is essentially bad. People are selfish, egoist, and the self-interest is the most important thing for all the people. Even today, the realist school of thought that believes in this nature of man, and they say in the international relations when it is applied that human beings are selfish, they are self-centered, and they try to promote their own interests. So that is why states are also aggregate of individuals. And since the states are aggregate of individuals, so that is why the states are also selfish, and that is why they try to promote their national interest in the foreign policy or in the international relations. And that leads to conflict and that leads to war and all. So, for them, the realist school of thought, it is, there is what is called constant struggle for power in the international arena between the states. So whether the nature of man is aggressive, bad, why this gloomy picture of human nature have been depicted by many scholars? Why do they say that human beings are aggressive, atomized, violent, and if their behavior is not regulated, then they will create a situation in which anarchy will be there and might is right will be the governing principle. And that is why they suggest that for maintaining order, for maintaining peace, for maintaining tranquility, there must be an organization to regulate their behavior. So that is why a state is to be created. But there are others. And and how do they give example? According to them, that human nature is aggressive, violent, it is evident from the fact that you'll find right from the primitive society to our time, you see, there is what? That the people in the very beginning, the instinct to fight is something which is natural and that is inherent in human nature. So in the primitive society, these people were fighting with, stones and sticks. Later on, they developed bows and arrows. Then you'll find sophistication came, and slowly and gradually, what happened that the people started developing sword, daggers, etc. And then you'll find the guns, and from guns to what we have achieved, the sophisticated missiles, automatic rifles, and then bombing, etc., whatever. So much so that we have achieved what is called the destructive capability of under nuclear bombs or hydrogen bombs and intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the constantly you'll find, right from the primitive society till date to our times, you'll find human beings have been trying to develop weapons and arms to fight. It shows that the instinct to fight, which is of course an animal instinct, but it is inherent in human nature. There is another school of thought, and that believes human beings are essentially rational. They have been bestowed with reason, and that's why they are not only rational, but they are peace loving. They have, sympathy, love, and compassion for others. So, this sympathy, love, and compassion is an integral part of human nature. And since they are rational, so that is why they are quite capable of governing their behavior. And human beings are not essentially, violent and aggressive. That is another approach. For example, according to John Locke, that the human beings are rational, they are peace loving, and they believe in mutual goodwill. So that debate is there. So whenever wars are there, violence is there, anarchy is there, civil war is there, we say that human nature is bad. That is the reflection of human nature. So the killing, bloodshed, murder, selfishness, aggressiveness, this is part and parcel of human nature. It all depends upon what kind of situation a person is passing through. So every political philosopher, social philosopher is the epitome of his time, and according to his own time and circumstances, he tries to interpret human nature. So whether you are going to interpret human nature in the light of the actions of Hitler, or whether you are going to interpret the human nature in the light of, Mahatma Gandhi's struggle, which was non-violent and peaceful struggle against British colonialism. This is very, very important to understand. Here we are going to discuss the Second World War was the most destructive in human history. Of course, if you see this destruction that was wrought out by the Second World War, millions of people died in the Second World War. There was bloodshed everywhere. So that way the destruction, wrought by the World War II developed a strong pacifist sentiment, which led to the establishment of the United Nations on 24th of October 1945. So you see that, the destructive wrought by the Second World War, we discussed that millions of people were killed. So that's why when the millions of people were killed, even the nations who have won, they have also lost. Because, they have lost their people, their economy was shattered, there was problem everywhere. And the countries that were defeated or humiliated, on those countries, that it can be understood that they found that militarist, expansionist, and aggressive foreign policy was not good for them, and it was quite destructive. So, it was mutually destructive for the victors as well as for the defeated powers, whether Axis powers or the Allied powers. But, one thing was very much clear, that after seeing the ferocious war, the destruction, and that it wrought about, the pacifist sentiments were very, very high all over. And this was the reason that from 1942 onward, when the war was already going on, the leaders of the world, they were already discussing that there should be some kind of organization which can regulate the behavior of the nations in such a way that at least they are not going to fight full-fledged war. Chances of war can be minimized. And for this reason only, just to maintain international peace and security, the United Nations was established. So the establishment of the United Nations was itself an achievement. Why an achievement? Because the League of Nations has already failed. And after the failure of the League of Nations, you see that you will find that the Second World War was fought. Because League of Nations was, not there. then you will find that when the United Nations was established, it is of course considered as one of the greatest development and achievements of the humankind at that time. Now, what kind of provisions of human rights are there in the UN Charter we have to see? First of all, it is the preamble of the United Nations which proclaims, and I read from the preamble, we the peoples of the United Nations determined. So what has been determined? So, people are saying we the preamble of the charter is saying we the peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war. First of all, this is very important. Why? Because war was the most important thing, that brought leaders together. And, the creation of the United Nations were there because of the war. War is, of course, the most flagrant violation of human rights. Because every kind of life is threatened. Liberty, life, everything. So, first of all, to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind. Twice means the First World War and the Second World War. So it is being said to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. So, this is also being determined. To reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. This is the preamble. So what we the people of United Nations, they determined, it is not only the maintenance of international peace and security, or to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war, but you'll also find what is being mentioned, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women. You see, gender equality, that is also being emphasized, and of nations large and small. Although you see that you will find the United Nations Charter itself suffers from what is called a logical contradiction. In the Charter, you will find it is saying that equal rights of nations large and small, but it is not there. In the UN Charter, you will find, if you see the composition of the Security Council of the United Nations, through Charter, the 5 privileged nations have already been created, and incidentally, they are the victors of the Second World War. So, as if it is victors' justice, where the 5 victors of the Second World War, they have been given what is called the veto power in the UN Security Council. So, there are some nations who are more privileged and powerful so far as the matters of international peace and security are concerned, or to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war is concerned. And there are nations who are not so powerful or not so privileged. So that is why, you cannot say that, the equal rights of nations, large and small, that is there, and that's why it is being demanded that the Security Council should be expanded to include some more nations. There are countries who are saying that in the Security Council, it is not the enlargement, rather the council should be abolished, or the veto power should be abolished. These are the things that we discuss. Besides the preamble, there are several provisions in the UN Charter for the promotion of human rights. Not only that, what we mentioned earlier. For example, Article 1 deals with the progress of the establishment of, with the purpose of the establishment of the United Nations. This Article 1 of the Charter is important after preamble, which is discussing the purposes of the establishment of the United Nations. And according to Article 1, the purposes of the United Nations are, we are going to discuss what are the purposes according to Article 1 of the UN Charter. And it is to maintain international peace and security. Of course, the peace was the most important thing that was required at that time. The pacifist sentiments were high, and the war, violence, the destruction, that was there everywhere. So that is why, to maintain international peace and security. And to that end, what is to be done to that end to maintain international peace and security? To take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace. Collective measures, of course, effective collective measures by all the nations of the world. They should come together and they should take, effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace. And for the suppression of acts of aggression and other breaches of peace. And to bring about peaceful means and in conformity with the principle of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. So, peace is a very important value when we try to promote human rights, and it is being emphasized here. Then, to develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace, that is being emphasized. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. It has an element of, anti-colonial struggle is being justified when you are talking about the self-determination of peoples. And to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. Then, to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, again important, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. So, this principle is what is being emphasized, principle of non-discrimination, that, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms. So, the rights and liberty, they are being emphasized for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, etc. And to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. So, is to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and to promote human rights, encourage respect for human rights, that become one of the aims you see here according to this article. Then after this we have Article 13 of the UN Charter, which empowered the General Assembly to initiate studies and make recommendations for the purpose of assisting in the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. It is not only but the Charter itself authorized or the UN General Assembly to achieve the goals that were set through the Charter, and that is that it has to supervise and it has to initiate studies and make recommendations of course in cooperation with Economic and Social Council for the purpose of assisting in realization of human rights. So, this was the job, this was UN authority, General Assembly was not only authorized, but rather it was just like a duty, a responsibility imposed upon it to conduct studies and recommend what should be done for the realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. Besides Article 13 of the UN Charter, we have Article 55, Article 56, Article 62, Article 68 and 76 of the UN Charter. They also deal with the role of the United Nations in the issues relating to human rights. So, there are several provisions in the Charter itself where you will find fundamental freedoms and human rights are being mentioned, emphasized, and the United Nations General Assembly, Economic Social Council, they are given power, authority, responsibility to, to conduct studies and to recommend measures for achieving the goal of promotion of promotion of human rights and fundamental freedoms. You will find nowhere protection is being used. Everywhere promotion is being used. You see, at that time, United Nations in 1945, when the discussion was going on, the first thing was that how to develop a consensus on the catalogue of rights. That was the problem. So that is why in the UN Charter, they are using promotion, not protection, because the protection mechanism was not created. So far, a specific protection mechanism for human rights was not created. So that is why the word promotion is being emphasized everywhere. So in 1945, when it was established, what was the position after that? It was the UN Charter that has these kind of provisions on human rights. And after that, we should keep in mind that in 2024, when we are sitting here, since its inception in 1945, the United Nations has adopted over 100 human rights instruments, comprising declarations, covenants, and conventions. So you see, from 1945, the General Assembly and then the ECOSOC, they were entrusted with the power and authority to deal with these issues. And finally, what has happened? That today, what is the position? That the United Nations has adopted more than 100 instruments of human rights, which, they may be in the form of declaration, which is non-binding, then covenants and the convention, which are binding. So you will find, and they include, when we talk of these, they include all kind of rights. For example, you will find that in these 100 human rights, more than 100 instruments of human rights, you will find, first of all, it is the International Bill of Rights that we have already discussed. It is UDHR, Universal Declaration of Right, that was after 3 years after the establishment of the United Nations. You will find that United Nations was able to adopt, the UN General Assembly was able to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or what was called by Mrs. Roosevelt as Magna Carta of Mankind. And that was a great achievement because, the consensus building at that time was very difficult. We have already discussed the problem of cultural relativism against universalism. What the United Nations was trying to do, it was trying to achieve a universal standard of achievement for all the people and all time to come. And that was achieved through what is called Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And before a Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a legally binding treaty United Nations has already adopted. And that was the Convention Against Genocide. The Convention Against Genocide was because genocide was a problem. You will find the Holocaust was committed. More than 60 lakh Jews were already executed or killed in Germany by Hitler. So that is why you see at that time genocide was a problem. And this was the reason that before this non-binding declaration, a legally binding treaty of human rights that is, that deals with the issue of genocide was already adopted by the United Nations, which is of course a big achievement. And after that, you'll find that the United Nations went to adopt later on many other treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that we have already discussed. So, the responsibility that were entrusted, the responsibility that were given to the United Nations, that is being carried out in this form, that the human rights treaties are being adopted. And remember that these two legally binding treaties were adopted by the United Nations at a time when the world was already divided into hostile blocks, and the ideological antagonism and divergent approaches followed by both the power blocks, that is, socialist and the capitalist bloc, the Soviet bloc or the American bloc, you will find decision making in the United Nations was a difficult task. We come to know about the use or misuse of veto power in the UN Security Council. But here credit must be given to the United Nations and the people, those who are dealing with the issues of human rights, that it was able to adopt International Bill of Rights, of course, from UDHR to ICCPR to ICSCR and their optional protocols, which together is called International Bill of Rights. After that, you will find that the rights of children, rights of women, rights of indigenous people, rights of persons with disabilities, and all kind of rights. Now, environmental rights and other rights, they all have been adopted. So, in this sense, we find that United Nations is not only an organization to save succeeding generation from the scourge of war. It is not only an organization to maintain international peace and security. Of course, that is important, but this has been realized that without promoting human rights, the basic human rights and fundamental freedoms, peace in the real sense of the term cannot be achieved. And this is the reason this approach of the United Nations to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and fundamental freedoms must be appreciated. Today, when we talk of human rights and we talk of international obligations of various countries to promote and protect human rights, it is because there is already a catalog of rights that is available, a parameter that is available which has been developed under the aegis of the United Nations. And this catalog is already expanding. So, in this sense, we can appreciate the endeavors of the United Nations so far as promotion and the protection of human rights is concerned. Earlier, it was talking about the promotion, but now the protection of human rights has become an important task that the United Nations has already taken up. Why this protection has been also included now? Because there is already institutional mechanism are there. For example, if the ICCPR is there, then there is implementation mechanism. If the ICSCR is there, there is implementation mechanism. If there are various, treaties of human rights, Convention Against Torture and all, Convention Against Genocide, and these things are there, we will find that there are already implementation mechanism as well. The corresponding law should be there. So the countries have their international obligations by just becoming the member of the United Nations, because they have already agreed upon the spirit of the Charter. So that even if they have not signed any international human rights treaty and they are just a member of the United Nations, it means by virtue of being the member of the United Nations, it is their duty, it is their responsibility to promote basic human rights and fundamental freedoms. So, this we have already discussed. Now, after this, we will be discussing in detail about the UDHR, that is Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then we will be also taking up the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. These three documents and the optional protocols of these covenants, they are called International Bill of Rights. So, with this we are going to conclude our lecture on United Nations and human rights. That we were dealing with the UN Charter, we were dealing with the provisions that are there in the Charter. And after that, what kind of job United Nations has done, what kind of work it has done, what are its achievements, what are its failures. We all these things will be taken up in our next class. So, thank you very much.